When I saw that tube of lubricant tucked under the driver's seat, a cold, uneasy feeling settled in my stomach like a weight I couldn't shake. I had been scrubbing the floor mats of my husband's car on a quiet Saturday morning, humming a tune I'd forgotten I knew, when my hand brushed against the plastic tube. At first, I didn't think much of it, just a stray item someone had left behind, something innocuous. But the way it was hidden, almost secretive, made my chest tighten. I stared at it, silent, feeling the quiet hum of the garage around me, the faint smell of car polish and motor oil mixing in the air. Something in me shifted in that instant. I swapped it for a tube of industrial glue I kept in the cupboard, without a word. My hand lingered on the glue, and I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected, a quiet, calculated resolve. It wasn't about anger at first. It was curiosity, a cautious experiment to see what would happen next. I wiped my hands on a rag, pretending to busy myself with the floor mats, but my mind raced with possibilities. Our life, from the outside, looked like a picture-perfect suburban story. My husband, Marcus, was a meticulous man. He worked long hours at his accounting firm, had a tendency to fuss over the smallest details, and always insisted on the garage being spotless. I, on the other hand, took care of our home with a quiet pride. The kitchen was usually filled with the smell of coffee and breakfast cooking, the living room arranged just so, with our photos lined up along the mantel. We had 2 kids, Jasmine and little Leo, who brought chaos and laughter in equal measure. Life was predictable, warm, safe. Or at least, that's what I thought. I remember that morning perfectly. The sunlight was slipping through the blinds at an angle that made dust motes shimmer like tiny stars in the air. Jasmine was watching cartoons in the living room, completely absorbed in a world of color and noise, while Leo toddled around in socks that never stayed on his feet. Marcus had promised to wash the car before heading to his client meetings, and I thought I'd beat him to it, make the car shine as a little surprise. There's something calming about scrubbing rubber mats, feeling the grime lift under your fingers. It's mundane work, but I loved it. It gave me a sense of control in a world that sometimes felt like it was spinning too fast. As I worked, I noticed small oddities, tiny signs I hadn't paid attention to before. A receipt crumpled in the back seat, a faint scent of something sweet and floral that wasn't perfume. Nothing concrete, just little threads that tugged at the corners of my mind. I shook them off, telling myself it was nothing. Marcus was a careful, orderly man. I knew he wouldn't leave something careless lying around. And yet, when my fingers brushed that tube of lubricant, I felt a cold spark of understanding. Something was hidden. Something I wasn't supposed to see. It's strange how quickly your mind starts spinning when you sense a secret. I can still remember sitting on the driveway, wiping my hands on the rag, staring at the glue tube I'd substituted, and listening to the sound of the neighbor's lawnmower humming in the distance. The world went on outside the garage as if nothing had happened, but inside me, a storm was beginning. I felt an odd mixture of guilt and excitement, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had the upper hand for the first time in a very long while. I remembered the way Marcus kissed me goodbye the night before. Quick, distracted, preoccupied with his phone. He had been distant lately, not in a confrontational way, just absent. And I, in my small domestic bubble, had chalked it up to stress, deadlines, the usual rhythms of life. Now, as I scrubbed the car, the lubricant tube hidden in my palm, I felt a tiny shift in perspective. I was no longer just a bystander in our life. I had a role, a part to play in a story that had quietly begun to unfold without my knowledge. The quiet suburban morning felt heavier somehow, the air denser, as if it knew the small secret I held in my hands. I returned the car mat to its place, careful not to disturb anything else, and stepped back to survey my work. The car gleamed spotless, but my eyes kept returning to the seat where the tube had been. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just cleaning a car. I was stepping into a new kind of awareness, one that would soon ripple through every corner of our home, our lives, our quiet little neighborhood. I closed the garage door gently, the metallic click echoing in the still air. Jasmine called for me from the living room, and I smiled, hiding the fluttering anxiety in my chest. Little did I know, the events set in motion by that single act, switching the tube for glue, would not just surprise Marcus. They would send shockwaves that would have the neighbors dialing 911 before the day was done. And all I could think as I walked back inside was how strange it felt to hold power in my hands so quietly, so deliberately, without a word. The house smelled of brewed coffee when I stepped back inside. Marcus's absence left a quiet that usually brought relief, but that morning it felt oddly heavy, like the calm before a storm. I set the rag in the sink, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the kitchen clock. Jasmine was perched cross-legged on the living room rug, still absorbed in her cartoons, and Leo toddled past, squealing as he chased a small, rolling ball. The ordinary rhythm of our home offered comfort, yet something had shifted in me. Life with Marcus had been steady, dependable, the kind of marriage people admired for its stability. We were both past the stage of grand romantic gestures. Our love was quiet, threaded through routines and small acts of care. Marcus making sure the bills were paid on time, me keeping the house in order and cooking meals that felt like a warm hug. On the surface, we were the picture of suburban harmony, but as many marriages do, the texture beneath was complicated. A look missed here, a sigh brushed aside there. Nothing alarming, until little things started to accumulate. Marcus had a habit of arriving home late, claiming overtime, client dinners, or work calls. And usually I believed him. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust the man I'd built a life with. But lately I noticed subtle changes. The faint perfume scent that lingered on his shirt, the way his eyes darted nervously when I mentioned plans, and his phone, always face down, always buzzing at odd hours. I'd caught myself thinking, maybe I'm imagining things, overreacting. But the tube under the car seat was not imagination. It was a solid, undeniable clue that something had changed, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know exactly what it meant. After breakfast, I went about my day like I always did. I cleaned, folded laundry, checked on the kids, and tried to engage Marcus in a few casual conversations over text. He replied quickly, polite, careful, like someone walking a tightrope, choosing his words precisely. My stomach twisted with questions I didn't dare ask out loud. It was all small things, insignificant to anyone else. But to me, these little threads were weaving a tapestry I wasn't ready to face. Jasmine bounded up to me, tugging at my sleeve. "Mom, can we go to the park later?" Her energy was contagious, and for a moment I let myself forget the tube, the glue, and the nagging feeling of unease. "Of course, baby," I said, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Leo tripped over his own feet and let out a high-pitched squeal, and I scooped him up, laughing despite the tension inside me. Life had a way of pulling you back into its ordinary rhythms, even when your mind was spinning with secrets. It was in those ordinary moments that I realized how much I had ignored. The tiny glances, the unusual patterns of behavior. Marcus had been giving me clues for weeks, and I had been too polite, too trusting, or too distracted to notice. And yet, I also knew the other side of myself. The part that simmered quietly, waiting for a moment when it could step in, observe, and act. That part had awoken when my fingers brushed that hidden tube, and it had not gone back to sleep. I remember that afternoon clearly. I sat at the kitchen table, Leo asleep in his crib, Jasmine building a tower of blocks beside me. I absent-mindedly traced the edge of the glue tube, turning it in my hands, thinking about what Marcus might do later in the day. He had left early for a client meeting, or so he said. I watched the sunlight shift across the table, feeling the small tension in my chest relax just slightly. I was calm, but a part of me was waiting, anticipating the moment when the truth would reveal itself. As I tidied up the kitchen, I reflected on how our life had always been a delicate balance. We loved each other, truly, but love alone doesn't shield you from secrecy, from betrayal, or from the quiet erosion of trust. And I realized something about myself. I would no longer wait to be a passive observer. Something inside me had shifted. That small, seemingly insignificant tube under the car seat had awakened a determination I didn't know I possessed. The day moved forward, the sounds of home blending together. The soft chatter of Jasmine, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the hum of the dryer spinning in the laundry room. I kept busy, washing dishes, folding clothes, wiping down counters, all while feeling the underlying tension grow in my chest. It was strange how domestic chores could feel like preparation for something monumental, something that hadn't happened yet, but was inevitable. And all the while I wondered about Marcus, where he was, who he was with, what he didn't want me to see. I told myself not to panic, not to overthink. But as a woman who had spent years reading between the lines, I knew the danger signs when I saw them. Something was coming, and the smallest act, switching the lubricant with glue, was my first step into an unfolding truth I hadn't fully anticipated. By evening, the house was quiet. Marcus had not yet returned. Jasmine was tucked into bed, murmuring about dreams filled with rainbows and unicorns. Leo had drifted off, clutching his favorite blanket. I sat in the living room, the faint smell of coffee lingering, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. And I realized in that quiet, ordinary moment that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet predict. The calm before the storm had settled over our home, and I was ready to see it through. The first clue came on a Tuesday afternoon, just after lunch. I had been folding the laundry while Marcus sat in the living room, scrolling through his phone, his brow furrowed like something was pressing on his mind. I don't know why, but I glanced at him and noticed the faintest change in his demeanor. It wasn't anything dramatic, no yelling, no confrontation, but the subtle tension in his shoulders, the quick, almost imperceptible glance over his shoulder, made my chest tighten. Something had shifted, and my instincts, honed over years of noticing the small signs, started humming. We had this unspoken rhythm in our marriage. I knew when he was distracted, when he was tired, and now, when something wasn't quite right. "Everything okay?" I asked casually, trying to sound nonchalant as I folded his shirts. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped his fingers on the armrest, a nervous habit he only showed when stressed. Finally, he muttered, "Yeah, just a busy day." His tone was flat, rehearsed, like he'd said the same line 1,000 times before. I wanted to let it go, wanted to chalk it up to work stress, but the unease in my gut had grown too strong. Later that evening, I noticed the faint smell again. A scent not his usual cologne, a hint of something sweet, floral, almost perfumed. It was subtle, lingering on the fabric of his jacket he had carelessly draped over the chair. My fingers traced the sleeve absent-mindedly, and I felt a tiny jolt of awareness. This wasn't work stress. Something was being hidden. Over the next few days, the signs multiplied. Little inconsistencies began cropping up like tiny cracks in glass. Receipts for coffee at cafes I had never been to. Text messages he left open on his phone, which I caught accidentally when he was in another room. Shortened phone calls, abrupt laughter that stopped when I entered the kitchen. The ordinary details of our life. The smell of dinner cooking, the sound of children's laughter, the hum of our refrigerator, became a backdrop to an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself, "You're imagining things. Marcus isn't the type." But the rational part of me, the part that had felt the weight of the tube and the glue, knew better. Something was happening behind my back. And the more I observed, the more subtle the signals became, the more they confirmed my growing suspicion. I began paying attention to how he navigated the house, where he placed his belongings, the way he avoided certain topics or deflected questions with casual jokes. Each day, I found myself silently noting patterns, little behaviors that didn't align with the man I thought I knew. One evening, I found him lingering by the door longer than usual, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and careful. I didn't listen, but the tension in the room was palpable, like a wire stretched tight, ready to snap. I also noticed something else, the neighborhood's quiet eyes. We had lived here for years. Our neighbors were friendly, observant, and often unintentionally revealing. I caught Mrs. Benson from across the street, glancing a little too long as Marcus's car pulled into the driveway. And though she smiled politely when our eyes met, there was a faint hint of curiosity, suspicion even, in her gaze. It was as if she knew what I hadn't yet fully grasped. It was in those moments, the quiet, ordinary pauses between chores and bedtime stories, that I felt a creeping sense of betrayal. Not outright, not yet, but a tension that wrapped itself around my chest, making each breath a little heavier, each glance toward the car or the hallway a little more loaded. I couldn't shake the feeling that something I hadn't seen before was waiting just beyond my reach. And then came the first real test of my intuition. One afternoon, I had parked my car in the garage and went inside to grab a drink. I heard the front door open and close, Marcus's footsteps on the hardwood. I froze mid-sip, instinctively aware of the faint perfume scent before he even entered the kitchen. He greeted me with his usual, "Hey, babe." But there was a hesitancy in his smile that made my stomach twist. I didn't say anything. I simply placed my cup down, turned, and went about washing a dish, pretending I hadn't noticed. But inside, I was alert, analyzing, calculating. I realized something important in that moment. Life doesn't always give you dramatic, obvious signs. Often, the first clue of betrayal is small: a scent, a glance, a hesitation. You catch it or you don't. And catching it means watching, waiting, and learning before you act. That day, I decided I would watch. I would pay attention. I would let the signs unfold naturally, and I would be ready. The glue in my drawer, the tube I had quietly replaced, became a symbol of my patience, my silent strategy. I wasn't angry yet, not really. I was observing, absorbing, preparing for what would inevitably come. And as I scrubbed the counter, listening to the soft buzz of the fridge, I realized that the ordinary, comforting details of my home, the smells, the sounds, the rhythm of daily life, would now serve as my backdrop for something far more consequential. Little did I know, the next days would reveal truths that were far messier, far more shocking than I could have imagined. And when the discovery came, it wouldn't just shake my marriage. It would shake the neighborhood, the children, and everyone who thought they knew the quiet, steady life I had built. It was late one evening when I finally found the evidence I had been sensing, the thing my gut had been warning me about for weeks. Marcus had gone out to run errands, leaving me at home with the kids. Jasmine was asleep, tucked under her pink comforter, and Leo had just drifted off in my arms. The house was quiet, the only sounds the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. That's when I decided to check his car again. Not to spy, not out of paranoia, but because something inside me demanded clarity. I opened the garage door slowly, careful not to wake anyone, and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of leather and motor oil. I had cleaned the mats only days before, so the car looked immaculate. I ran my hands over the dashboard, the seats, and then, almost instinctively, I leaned down and checked under the driver's seat. My eyes widened. The tube of lubricant, the one I had quietly replaced with industrial glue, was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to process what this meant. I had hoped for some minor infraction, something harmless, but my instincts told me this was different. I glanced in the back seat, where a crumpled receipt peeked out from under the seat, and I picked it up. My hands trembled slightly as I read the small details. A name, a time, a cafe I had never heard of, and a subtle hint of intimacy in the message printed on the receipt. A cold, sinking feeling settled into my chest. The truth was unavoidable now. Marcus had been hiding something, and it was serious. I put the receipt down and ran my hands over the steering wheel, gripping it tightly, trying to steady myself. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but what surged stronger was disbelief. How long had this been happening? How much had I missed? I remember the next moments as a blur. I sat in the car, staring at the space where the tube had been, feeling a mix of shock, heartbreak, and an unexpected thrill of control. I had known something was off, had felt it for days, and now I had confirmation. The betrayal was tangible, almost physical, like a weight pressing against my chest. When Marcus returned, I was waiting in the kitchen, the children asleep, the house dark except for the soft glow of the lamp over the counter. He greeted me casually, unaware of the storm I carried inside. "Hey, how's your afternoon?" he asked. I set the crumpled receipt on the counter in front of him. He froze. I could see the panic in his eyes before he even spoke. Where did you get that?" he stammered, voice tight, defensive. "I found it," I said softly, almost too calmly. "I know what you've been doing, Marcus. I know about the cafe, the meetings, the little lies." My hands didn't shake. I made sure of it. And I know why that tube of lubricant was under the seat. He looked at me, disbelief etched across his face, as if I had just delivered some surreal accusation. It's not what you think," he said, his words faltering. I raised an eyebrow. "Not what I think," I echoed. "Then explain it. Explain why you've been hiding things, why the small details didn't add up, why my instincts told me something was wrong." There was silence. Heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. And then finally he confessed. His voice was low, ashamed, and full of guilt. The details spilled out: meetings, late nights, encounters I hadn't imagined, all hidden behind the facade of work and normalcy. The betrayal wasn't just in the secrecy. It was in the choices he had made, the deception woven carefully into our daily life. I listened, numb and aching, feeling a mix of sorrow and vindication. I had suspected, I had watched, and now I had the undeniable truth. The man I had trusted, loved, and built a life with had deceived me. And yet, amidst the heartbreak, I also felt a strange clarity. The glue in my drawer, the small, calculated act of swapping the tube. It wasn't revenge yet. It was preparation. It was my quiet way of reclaiming a measure of control before the inevitable confrontation. I didn't scream, didn't cry aloud. I sat in that dimly lit kitchen, listening to his confessions, the weight of his words pressing down on the room like an invisible hand. There was anger simmering, yes, but it was measured, intentional. I could feel the power shift slightly. I wasn't helpless anymore. I wasn't blindsided. I had seen the signs, and now I knew. After he left the kitchen to pace, muttering apologies, I went back to the garage. The car gleamed under the fluorescent light, innocent in appearance, hiding the potential chaos within. I picked up the glue tube, feeling its cold, hard weight in my hand. I didn't have to imagine what would happen next. By the time the neighbors started hearing strange noises, yells, the sounds of a struggle, they couldn't have known what had triggered it. I had orchestrated it quietly, deliberately, with patience and precision. The glue, the swap, the careful monitoring. It all led to a moment that would leave them dialing 911, bringing paramedics to our doorstep, and leaving Marcus humiliated, shocked, and utterly unprepared for the consequences. I stepped back into the kitchen, listening to the quiet hum of the house again, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. The betrayal had been revealed, the truth exposed, and I had witnessed it with my own eyes. It was messy, painful, and humiliating, but it was real. And in that reality, I found a strange sense of empowerment. I was no longer the passive observer. I had taken the first steps in reclaiming my life, and nothing would be the same again. The next morning, the house felt heavier, the air charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. Marcus moved around cautiously, avoiding my eyes, every gesture measured and careful. I noticed it immediately. The way he held his coffee cup a little tighter, the way he lingered by the door before stepping into a room. It was a small victory, but I didn't let myself savor it too long. There was work to be done. I had spent the previous night replaying every detail, every clue I had noticed over the past weeks. The tube under the seat, the crumpled receipt, the faint perfume scent. Each piece had formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Now I had to act, and I didn't act impulsively. I acted deliberately, methodically, with a calm that masked the storm in my chest. The car was my first stage. I kept it in the garage, as spotless as ever, the glue tube tucked securely in my pocket. I didn't need to confront Marcus verbally. The car would speak for itself. Later that morning, he mentioned needing to run to a client meeting. His usual line of work, practiced and believable. I nodded, pretending to be distracted by Jasmine's breakfast, but my mind was fully alert. I waited, watched, and anticipated. When he left, I moved quickly, slipping the glue into the place where the lubricant had been. It was such a simple act, quiet, almost invisible, but I felt a thrill of control. I didn't gloat, didn't rush. I cleaned up, returned the kitchen to order, and carried on with my day, letting the ordinary rhythms of life mask the extraordinary plan unfolding in silence. Hours later, I heard the car engine start. I stayed in the living room, folding laundry, listening. Then came the first scream. It was abrupt, sharp, and horrifying, Marcus's voice, a mixture of shock and confusion. I froze mid-fold, my heart hammering in my chest. Then came the sound of something sticking, the harsh tearing of fabric, the futile attempts to move. My hands gripped the folded laundry, knuckles white. I didn't run. I didn't yell. I simply watched from the doorway as Marcus struggled with the car door, the glue having done its work with cruel efficiency. I could hear the neighbors' voices, muffled through the walls, calling out in alarm. The chaos I had predicted, orchestrated quietly and deliberately, was unfolding. And though part of me winced at the reality of it, at the sound of his panic, the humiliation, I also felt a strange clarity, a sense of justice that was quiet, measured, and exact. By the time they called an ambulance, I was in the kitchen, calm, holding a cup of coffee, observing through the window as Marcus tried to explain the situation to the neighbors. The embarrassment on his face, the confusion, the helplessness. It wasn't cruelty, not really. It was the natural consequence of choices made in secrecy, of deception left unchecked. And I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. Later, when the paramedics arrived, Marcus was mortified, and I maintained my composure, recounting events carefully, truthfully, without embellishment. There was no gloating, no vindictive satisfaction. The truth, as it often does, spoke for itself. The consequences of his hidden actions had arrived, unvarnished and undeniable, and I watched with measured awareness as he faced them. I spent the rest of the day reflecting quietly, caring for Jasmine and Leo, maintaining our routines as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And in that reflection, I realized something important. Action doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes it's silent, precise, and effective. Sometimes it's about setting the stage and letting the truth speak for itself. I also realized that my anger, my sense of betrayal, was no longer destructive. It had become a tool, a lens through which I could assess, plan, and reclaim the agency I had quietly ceded over the years. The glue, the swapped tube, the careful observation. It was all part of a measured response, a way to reclaim equilibrium in a life that had been quietly unbalanced. By evening, Marcus was quiet, subdued, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the hesitation in his eyes. The uncertainty, the shame, the recognition of the breach of trust. And I understood something fundamental. Revenge isn't about cruelty. It's about clarity, justice, and the restoration of balance. My actions hadn't been about humiliating him. They had been about asserting the reality of truth, about ensuring that deception could no longer dominate our home. And as I sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunset filter through the blinds, I felt a cautious sense of relief. The house, once quiet and ordinary, had become a stage for revelation, a mirror reflecting the choices we make and the consequences they bring. And in that reflection, I saw myself, not just as a wife, but as a woman who could act decisively, think clearly, and uphold her dignity in the face of betrayal. The day's events were messy, unpredictable, and intensely human. But amidst the chaos, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control, clarity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth, once hidden, could not remain so forever. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Not with gossip yet, but with a quiet tension that made even the birdsong feel sharp. Word of the incident with Marcus's car had already spread through the grapevine, though no one knew the full story. I watched from the kitchen window as Mrs. Benson walked her dog past our driveway, glancing our way with a mixture of curiosity and concern. I smiled politely, feeling the small sense of calm that comes when truth begins to surface. Marcus moved through the house cautiously, the events of the previous day weighing on him. He avoided eye contact, spoke less, and the faint embarrassment I had glimpsed during the incident lingered. I kept my interactions neutral, calm but firm. The children's routines went on as usual, the ordinary sounds of breakfast and school preparations grounding me in the life we had to maintain. But under that ordinary exterior, something had shifted. Marcus knew, the neighbors knew in fragments, and I, quietly, had reclaimed a sense of control that had been absent for too long. By mid-morning, a few neighbors had stopped by. They spoke politely, carefully, as if testing the waters. "Is everything okay?" Mrs. Henderson asked, eyebrows raised. I nodded, offering the smallest smile. "Yes, everything's fine now," I said, letting the words carry both reassurance and subtle authority. I didn't elaborate, and I didn't need to. People sensed when consequences had been delivered. The details often weren't necessary. It was in those hours that I realized the true power of subtle revelation. Marcus hadn't faced humiliation at the hands of strangers. He had faced the consequences of his choices, quietly, visibly, in a way that couldn't be denied. The glue had done its work, and in its wake, the truth had become unavoidable. No embellishments, no drama, just facts, and the inevitable reflection that follows when secrets are exposed. Later, a friend of Marcus's from work stopped by. He spoke softly, hesitant, trying to navigate the awkwardness of the situation. Marcus attempted explanations, excuses, but the truth, when it surfaces, has a way of cutting through even the most carefully constructed stories. My own role in the unfolding events remained invisible to them. I didn't need recognition. The revelation in itself was sufficient. As the day progressed, I noticed subtle changes in how Marcus interacted with both me and the community. He was quieter, more reflective, and I sensed genuinely aware of the breach of trust. He approached me briefly in the late afternoon, voice low and careful. I understand," he said simply, eyes downcast. No grand apologies, no dramatic gestures, just acknowledgement. That, I realized, was the real consequence. The recognition of fault, the confrontation with truth, the quiet, enduring awareness of mistakes. I also saw the effects ripple through our immediate circle. A few neighbors exchanged cautious glances when Marcus walked past. Subtle nods or hints of empathy mingled with curiosity. The situation had shifted the social dynamic in ways that were unspoken but palpable. Truth, once revealed, has a way of reshaping relationships quietly, respectfully, without the need for overt spectacle. By evening, the house was calm again. I cooked dinner, the familiar smells of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables filling the air. Jasmine and Leo played in the living room, their laughter a balm to the tension that had gripped the house. Marcus helped quietly, subdued, mindful, as if the events of the day had instilled a new awareness in him. Sitting down to eat, I realized something important. Public consequence is not about spectacle. It's about clarity, accountability, and the restoration of balance. Marcus had faced a consequence that was proportionate, direct, and rooted in reality. Not in anger, but in truth. And the neighborhood, the people who mattered, had witnessed the integrity of that process without unnecessary drama. Later that night, as I tucked the children into bed, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not in revenge, but in justice. The lie, the secrecy, the betrayal, had been met with an outcome that reflected reality. Marcus had been confronted with the consequences of his choices, and in doing so, the house, the family, and even the neighborhood had been reminded that truth matters, that secrets have a way of surfacing, and that integrity, even when delayed, carries weight. I sat in the quiet living room after the children were asleep, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, feeling the steady rhythm of life continuing around me. The storm had passed, though its lessons lingered. I thought about how small actions, quiet, deliberate, intentional, can create profound effects. How patience, observation, and clarity can sometimes achieve more than anger or confrontation. And I realized that the real consequence wasn't just for Marcus. It was for all of us, a reminder that honesty, respect, and accountability are not optional in the lives we share with those we love. By the end of that day, the neighborhood had its answer. Marcus had his reckoning, and I had my peace, quiet, dignified, and resolute. The story, messy as it had been, had unfolded with a rhythm that reflected the real world. Subtle, emotionally charged, and deeply human. The days that followed were quieter, but the quiet wasn't empty. It was filled with reflection, with slow rebuilding, with the small, subtle ways a life returns to order after upheaval. Marcus and I had conversations, soft, honest, sometimes painful, that I never thought we would have. No shouting, no dramatic ultimatums. Just words, careful, deliberate, meant to repair what could be repaired. I watched him struggle, quietly, with the awareness of his betrayal. He showed up differently now. Not perfectly, not without flaw, but with an acknowledgement that his actions had consequences. And I realized that healing isn't about perfection. It's about presence, honesty, and a willingness to face the hard truths, even when they're uncomfortable. For myself, the healing took the form of small rituals. Walking the kids to the park, lingering in the kitchen while the coffee brewed, listening to Jasmine sing to Leo in the afternoons. I focused on the rhythm of ordinary life, the little details that ground you. The warmth of the sun on the porch, the smell of freshly baked bread, the quiet laughter that drifts through a house when love is present despite its imperfections. I also took time to examine my own heart, to understand what had drawn me to act the way I did. The swap of the tube for the glue wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming a measure of agency I had quietly lost, about asserting that I would no longer be a passive participant in my own life. I had acted, yes, but I had acted with clarity, precision, and moral intent, not cruelty. That understanding became a pillar of strength I carried forward. Marcus and I began rebuilding trust slowly. There were no grand gestures, just small commitments. Being honest about whereabouts, sharing frustrations rather than hiding them, acknowledging when one of us had erred. The process wasn't easy, but it was real, grounded in the reality of our lives rather than in fantasy or wishful thinking. The children remained a guiding force through it all. Watching Jasmine and Leo play, laugh, and grow reminded me that life moves forward whether we're ready or not. Their innocence and joy became a mirror, reflecting the potential for renewal and for hope. I learned to cherish the small moments. Their tiny hands holding mine, the whispered secrets they shared before bed, the way they noticed the subtle beauty of everyday life. Even the neighborhood, once buzzing with whispers, began to settle back into normalcy. The neighbors who had been curious now offered smiles and nods of respect, not judgment. In their quiet way, They had witnessed the unfolding of truth and consequence, and life continued with an underlying acknowledgement of honesty and integrity. It was a subtle reminder that actions, once taken, ripple outward in ways we sometimes don't anticipate. One evening, I found myself sitting on the porch alone, watching the sunset spill golden light across the yard. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the garden, the soft hum of cicadas punctuating the stillness. I thought about the journey I had been on, the suspicion, the discovery, the quiet act that set events into motion, and the way life had unfolded in the aftermath. There was sorrow, yes, but also empowerment, clarity, and a deep sense of moral alignment. I reflected on the lessons learned. That deception, no matter how carefully concealed, eventually surfaces. That patience, observation, and deliberate action can bring justice without cruelty. And that personal strength is often found in quiet, ordinary moments rather than in grand gestures. I understood that forgiveness isn't always necessary, but acknowledgement and accountability are. And sometimes the most profound victories come not from drama, but from measured, thoughtful decisions that honor one's own integrity. Life began to regain a sense of balance. The children's laughter returned to the forefront of our days. Marcus became more thoughtful, and I felt a new kind of calm settle over our home. Not everything was perfect, not every wound had fully healed. But there was a rhythm now, steady and grounded, shaped by the truth that had been revealed and the quiet resilience that had followed. I had learned to trust my instincts, to observe the small details, and to act with purpose. And in doing so, I discovered that empowerment isn't loud. It's subtle, deliberate, and deeply human. Healing, likewise, is a process of small, meaningful steps rather than sudden, sweeping change. As I tucked the children into bed each night, kissed them on the forehead, and listened to the quiet of the house, I felt a gentle satisfaction. The chaos had passed. The truth had been confronted. And I had emerged not just intact, but stronger, wiser, and more aware of the delicate balance between love, trust, and personal agency. In the end, the story of that day, the tube, the glue, the confrontation, the chaos, and the ultimate resolution, wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about seeing clearly, acting deliberately, and understanding the moral weight of our choices. And as the night deepened and the stars appeared, I felt an enduring sense of peace, a reminder that even in human imperfection, there is the potential for grace, insight, and quiet triumph. As I sit here now, in the quiet of my living room, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft breathing of my children in the next room, I think about what happened that day. The small acts, the secrets, the hidden truths, all of them led to a moment that changed everything. And yet, in the aftermath, I realized that the real power isn't in exposure or revenge. It's in clarity, in patience, and in taking deliberate steps that honor your own integrity. Life isn't fair. People make mistakes, sometimes big ones. And sometimes the ones we love the most betray us, even in subtle ways. But the lesson I learned, and one I hope you carry with you, is that we are never powerless. We can observe, reflect, and act thoughtfully. We can set boundaries, demand honesty, and reclaim agency in our own lives. I also learned that healing doesn't happen overnight. It happens in quiet moments, watching a child sleep, taking a walk in the sunlight, breathing through the tension, and choosing a response that aligns with your values. And sometimes the smallest gestures, a decision to act, a choice to confront, a moment of patience, can have the greatest impact. So I ask you, my dear friend, as gently as I can, have you ever had to reclaim your life from secrecy, betrayal, or deception? How did you act, and what did it teach you about yourself? Share your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. And if this story spoke to you, consider subscribing and supporting these stories of quiet strength, human complexity, and the power of moral clarity. Because sometimes the smallest truths carry the heaviest weight and the most enduring lessons.